Just waiting for everybody to come in.
Children, institution ain't just a building, but a method, a habit, black and brown bodies filled them. We ain't seen as human beings with feelings. Will the U.S. ever be us, Lord willing? For now we know the new Jim Crow, the stop, search, and arrest our souls. Police and policies patrol, philosophies of control. A crew hand take it home. We let go to free them so we can free us. America's moment to come to Jesus.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, or good evening, rather. I want to thank everybody for joining us for our monthly community conference series, where we discuss the issues that are critically important to our assembly district right here in the 31st. Tonight, I'm going to share some updates as I usually do in the community conference, but then also bring on our guests to talk about criminal justice, which is to this month's topic. So some of the updates are, if you're someone who lives in the Assembly District 31 and you are looking for housing vouchers, the Housing Choice Voucher Program deadline is tomorrow to apply for this voucher tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. So go to www.hcr.ny.gov/Section 8. Again, that's www.hcr.ny.gov/Section 8. And so in our office, we have two upcoming job fairs, one on June 9th, the second one on June 6th. We're partnering with the Office of Second Chance Employment to make sure that people who are justice involved can have employment opportunities, which is super, super important. Information on how to register for those job fairs can be found on our social media. Please join our email listserv by going to my website, nyassembly.gov/Khalil-Anderson. And you can go there and sign up for our email blast so you can know when and how to register for the job fairs. You can drop your emails here on the chat or even on our social media pages, and we'll make sure a staff member grabs your email and adds you to our email blast. So super important that if we have any resources or anything happening in the district that you are aware and privy to that information. Some legislative updates. As we're coming to a close in my first legislative session as your state assembly member, we have some really good legislation that's coming down the pipe. One bill in particular, as a chairperson of the subcommittee on banks and underserved communities, I'm proud that my first bill, Assembly Bill number 07324A, has passed through the Banks Committee as well as the Rules Committee, and will certainly be on the floor shortly. What the bill does is it essentially directs the New York State Department of Financial Services to conduct a study on the COVID-19 pandemic on underbanked and underserved communities and their access to loans and resources during that period. We know our community suffered, but we want to make sure that the agencies responsible are able to provide the resources necessary for our communities to move forward post-COVID-19 pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to invite up our guest panelists who will be joining us tonight to discuss the topic of criminal justice reform. We have a myriad of different things we want to discuss, from probation and parole justice to community safety and law enforcement accountability to police accountability legislation recently proposed by the New York State Attorney General, and even something local. We had a scandal at the 105th precinct in my district, in the Rosedale Springfield Garden section of my district, where officers were accused and charged, rather, of bribery and bribery schemes, also using racial epithets against members of our community. So these are the things that we want to discuss, and how accountability can perpetuate itself through our communities, as it hasn't for far too long in the police force. So I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz, who represents the 39th District in Queens. We'll allow her to tell us a little bit about herself and introduce what she's working on.
Well, first of all, Khalil, thank you so much for having me join you today. We were actually just joking around before this started about my visit to your part of this beautiful borough of Queens after you won. I am so proud to serve with you, and I'm so happy that we get to work together. I represent Jackson Heights, Corona, and Elmhurst. That's the 39th Assembly District, which unfortunately during this pandemic has been hit so hard by the repercussions, the unemployment, the deaths. We have the lowest vaccination rate. It's just a lot. But with the support of so many, we've been able to survive, and we are working to make our community even better. Over the last 2.5 years that I've been serving, I'm starting my second term now. Well, midway through my second term. During COVID time, everything feels like 10 years. I have worked on a lot of issues around criminal justice reform, and I think the topic today is it's so needed that we have this conversation, because as much progress as we've made over the last year, because let's be real, a lot of the progress we've been able to make on real reform, 50A, body cameras, etc. A lot of that has come over the last year, and a lot of it was a result of one of the most horrific murders we've seen in our country at the hands of police, when people just couldn't take it anymore, went out to the streets and took it upon themselves to advocate and to fight back. It kind of put an extra fire on the feet of legislators for us to act. And I'm proud that we did it, but there is still so much work that we need to do. That's what we'll get to in a little while, but that is who I am. That is who I get to represent. On a little bit of background, I am an attorney by trade, and I've practiced very little, but I did practice some criminal defense. I will say anecdotally, criminal defense and criminal justice reform was not necessarily something I thought would make it or break it for me in the legislature. And what I mean by that is it's been the line in the sand where I've been willing to vote no on budgets, on projects, and push back when I thought that what we were doing was simply going to send more of our people, Black and brown folk, to jail, or was going to send them to die, especially during COVID. And unexpectedly, it became my line on the sand, and I am extremely proud of the work we've been doing, and there's so much more that we need to do.
Thank you so much for the amazing work you do in your district, Catalina, and all the work that you do in fighting for criminal justice reform. And I'm super excited to get into that tonight. I'm just going to introduce our next panelist, Mr. Shamari Ward from the Legal Aid Society. Will tell us a little bit who he is and a little bit about what he does, and then we'll get right into it.
Hi, my name is Shamari Ward. Thanks for having me, Assembly Member. And hello, Assembly Member Cruz. So my name is Shamari Ward. I work for the Legal Aid Society in New York. I work in the Special Litigation and Law Reform Unit in the Juvenile Rights Practice. I work with kids mainly, kids who are involved in the juvenile justice system and kids who are involved in the child welfare system. And part of my job is to do legislative advocacy. And what that means is, I mean, you all know what that means, but I'm just saying it because I have to say it. But part of what that means is I help to push laws that'll help people in our community. So I lobby for laws that'll help bring about change, the sort of positive change that Assemblymember Anderson and Assemblymember Cruz have been talking about. Because I come from the community that I serve. I grew up in Brooklyn, went to high school in Brooklyn, junior high school, elementary school, learned how to ride a bike in Brooklyn. Got my Walkman stolen in Brooklyn. Like I'm from Brooklyn, and so
we won't hold that against you. We're both Queens folks. I mean, I was born in Kings County, but I'm a Queens guy. But
I hang out in Far Rockaway, so I have some Queens connection.
There we go.
And, so the thing that one of the bills that I'm working on right now, that me and my team are working on right now, is the DNA bill. Should I just jump right into that, or do you want me to?
Well, we're gonna lead into it. First, I want to talk about Clean Slate, and Catalina's going to talk a little bit about Clean Slate, and then I'll talk about the companion bill that I am sponsoring in the Assembly, Assembly Bill number 7440. which creates the Office of Expungement, and then we'll get right to the DNA stuff in the next segment of it. But I'll allow my colleague to take it away.
So we began this road of talking about clean slate because it's what people needed, especially right now, to survive. We have close to 2.5 million people in the state of New York who, when they go and apply for a job, when they go and apply for housing, when they go and try to do anything positive with their lives that requires some sort of background check, they will often be stopped at the door before they can even get a real chance, because their criminal record comes up and immediately they're treated different. We're not supposed to. It's not supposed to be the way that things happen. We are often taught since we're little that the criminal justice reform, that when you commit a crime and you go to jail, it's supposed to punish you and you're supposed to come out and redo your life and become part of the community. But the way we've actually set up our criminal justice system doesn't allow for that. It's perpetual punishment, because you commit a crime and you come out of jail, and this dark cloud stays with you, and a cloud that everybody can see. And a cloud that everybody can see, and a cloud that makes you into a second-class citizen. And it became even more important to do this bill now, because what's happened is during COVID, many people lost their ability to earn a living, their ability to survive. And so we now have a class 3 of citizens in our country, a class 3 of people. We have everyday people. We have the folks who lost their job, and then we have the folks who couldn't even get a job in the first place. We have the folks with a criminal background. So many of these, the advocate groups, and I am so thankful for them for the honor of helping carry this bill, came to Senator Myrie and I with the idea of having a bill, and I've always called it a life-saving bill, because I think when you really truly give someone a second chance at being a member of the community, you're giving them a second chance at life. And the bill basically would take it into steps, depending on, there are certain crimes that are excluded, but depending on how long you've been out of jail, and we have one of Shamar's colleagues who's going to join us, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this. But what it basically does is, it's a 2-step process. Depending on the crime, after a few years, you can do what's called sealing, an automatic sealing of your record. And then after a few more years, it's an automatic expungement. And the difference is key. Under the sealing of your record, the only people who can really see it are the district attorney's offices and law enforcement, and certain agencies, the only ones. And then when it's expunged, it basically is as if it goes away. And there's been a lot of talk around, what does this really mean for certain crimes that are tough to talk about, like sexual abuse, like the crimes that land you on the sex offender registry. And I think it's important to bring this up, because I don't want the pain of survivors to be used to excuse the idea that people should be perpetually punished. I am a survivor myself. I've talked about it openly on the assembly floor. I've talked about it on the press. I talk about it whenever I can, because I think it's important for people to understand that that survivors come in all shapes, colors, creeds. And so what this bill does is, if you are on the sex offender registry, you can't take advantage of the expungement and the sealing process. You just can't. And there's other serious crimes that wouldn't allow you to do that. But for most crimes, let's say I was 20 years old, and let's remember, a lot of these crimes are crimes of poverty. I was 20 years old. I was broke. I stole a car. I didn't hurt anyone, but I stole a car and I tried to sell it, and I got caught. I end up getting convicted. I go to jail. I serve a few years. When I come out, I can go through the process, which becomes automatic. And the automatic part is going to be it's going to be key. And I'll explain to you why it's going to be key. And so I come out a few years after. It's depending on the type of crime. It's anywhere between 1 and 3 years. I can get my record sealed. And so only district attorneys and law enforcement folks can see it, and some other agencies. And then after a few years, it becomes automatically expunged as if it didn't exist. And the reason why that's important, it's because you want, if you what's saying, if you did the time, if you did the crime, you pay the time. You've done that. Why shouldn't you get an actual real chance at a better life, at a job, at not being harassed by the police because they stop you and they run your license and they see that you've committed a crime in a previous lifetime? Because often it's a previous lifetime. We're often talking about 10, 20, 15 years before. And this is still stopping people from actually having a real life. And so I earlier mentioned that the automatic piece is key, because a couple of years ago, we actually passed a law that would allow people to apply for expungement and sealing of their cases. But it's expensive because you have to hire a lawyer, which means poor people, mostly people of color, can't access it. It's not the kind of thing where, you just fill out an application online, somebody looks at it and it's automatic. That's not how it works. There's a whole process that goes with it. And so while I find that law extremely well-intentioned and I'm very thankful for it, for poor people, for people of color, it is not something we can access. And so when you make something automatic, you're not putting the burden on the poor person, on the formerly incarcerated person who could barely afford a lawyer in the first place. And probably, that's a whole other conversation, but it's probably why they got convicted, because they probably didn't have the kind of representation that most rich people get. Let's just say that most rich people get. And so now you've been convicted of that crime, and now you have to find money for a new lawyer, for a new process of expungement. You just can't do it. And so what we're looking to do is create a kind of system where if you've been convicted of a crime, of a certain type of crimes, you pay that time, you finish your sentence, and it's not it's not part of those excluded ones. And I reiterate that a lot because people are going to want to make this seem like some free-for-all. Everybody's going to go, have some sort of party after this, and it's not. It's simply a chance to live. I just saw someone's comment that came through that they had wanted to get a certain job, and it didn't allow them to do that. And so what we want to make sure is that yes, we are working to protect the community because we are excluding certain crimes from access to this automatic sealing and expungement process. I don't ever want to, I don't want people to think we're not. We are protecting the community. But we're also giving people a real second chance because everyone deserves it. Everyone deserves it. And what we're looking to do is hopefully pass it this session. We have another 2 weeks or so. So we're crossing our fingers that we can get it done because I think people can't afford to wait anymore. The longer we wait, the more people go without a real home, a real job, and a real chance. And that's where we're at.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catalina, for really sharing what Clean Slate is about. And I'm honored and privileged to be working alongside you and carrying the companion bill, which is Assembly Bill number 7440, which is the Office of Expungement. And what the bill does, to Catalina's point, it helps facilitate the sealing and expungement of criminal convictions by essentially creating an entity within the Division of Criminal Justice Services, so that to establish an office that oversees the sealing and expungement of convictions, but also acts as an advocate for those who are eligible for convictions, for sealed and expunged convictions. And so the bill sets up duties and responsibilities for the office, such as informing people that they're eligible, also ensuring people that are eligible both accurately in a timely manner have that information, and also acting as an advocate for those who are eligible, just sharing that information with them, and making sure that the executive and the legislature have that impact on sealing and expunging criminal convictions, which is critically important, making sure that we operationalize the incredible work that my colleague is doing, Assemblywoman Cruz, as well as my colleagues in the Senate who are carrying both the companion bills, Senator Bailey as well as Senator Myrie on your side. Myrie's carrying your bill. And that's critical. That's important, right? We want to make sure that people have a second chance. We're not overly punishing and perpetuating, right, harm on communities, on people who are working to be rehabilitated or have been rehabilitated and can reintegrate into our community safely in a way that is respectable to the neighborhood. So that's so super important. And I think one of the things that's important about both of our bills is that the idea is to ensure, right, that we're giving folks a second chance. We're giving people an opportunity to say, look, you've done something wrong, but that doesn't mean that you should be punished for it for the rest of your life. It means that you could turn over a new leaf and have resources at your fingertips to be able to move on with life. And I hope I described both of our bills and the mechanics of both of our bills in a way that doesn't offend, but also allows folks to understand what we're trying to get at, which is so critical and important. I'm gonna pull in Brother Ward here from the Legal Aid Society to talk a little bit about the legislation that he's working on as it relates to DNA.
All right, thank you. So yeah, again, I work at the Legal Aid Society. My job is legislative reform, and I work on legislation, bills, laws, etc. I try to push and promote laws that will help my clients. And my clients are young people who are involved in the juvenile justice system, and young people who are involved in the child welfare system. And what we find is that there's often a whole lot of crossover. A lot of young people who are involved in the juvenile justice system and adults have a history in the foster care system. And there's, a pretty clear reason for that correlation is because the foster care system often fails them and they end up on the wrong side of the law. That's a conversation for another day. But the reason why I mention that is because these are some of the vulnerable folks, the young people that we serve that end up in New York City's rogue DNA database. So I just want to talk a little bit about the bill, and I'll talk a little bit more about the rogue database in a second. So just a little bit of background. There is a bill, there's a law that exists, right, that permits the state to keep people's DNA profiles. And those people are specifically people who have been convicted of a crime. So if you have been convicted of a crime in New York State, chances are you are in the states. And you have a DNA sample, chances are that DNA sample, there was a profile created from that DNA sample, and it's located in that state database, that very regulated state database. What New York City is doing is creating a database that exists outside of the law, and this database in New York City, it isn't limited to only folks who have been convicted. It includes people who have not been convicted. It includes children, and I'll get to that in a second. But I just want to start by saying when New York's legislature authorized the state DNA index to store profiles from people convicted of crimes, New Yorkers were assured that their genetic privacy would remain protected against law enforcement overreach. And law enforcement overreach is something that Assemblymember Cruz alluded to that's been an issue in our communities for a really long time. And in the past 12 months, we've had a ton of changes in our communities. We've had a ton of strife vis-a-vis COVID and economic downturn, et cetera. But one of the things that has come out of this is this sort of pushback against what law enforcement is able to do, the pushback against the ways in which law enforcement is able to exploit our communities, right? So local governments, most notably New York City, are ignoring the balance between the state legislature and city agencies, ignoring that balance by running their own rogue DNA index without any regulation, accountability, or oversight. So New York City's sort of shadow data bank, as I said earlier, contains profiles from children as young as 12, contains DNA profiles of people never charged or prosecuted, And it contains profiles of innocent people from communities of color who were specifically targeted based on their race. And what that looks like is, you were arrested, or maybe you were even questioned by the police. You have a DNA sample taken from you, whether it was by consent or whether it was taken secretly or surreptitiously is the word that we use. Surreptitiously is the word that we use. That sample then goes to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, to the city, and the city stores that profile, stores that DNA sample, that DNA profile in that database that I'm talking about, despite whether or not you were convicted of a crime or even arrested or even charged with a crime. Whereas the state database would only include you if you were convicted of a crime. So this bill that I'm sort of trying to push in the face of every elected official that I can get on the phone, right? This bill clarifies the law to protect the state DNA index and end the other databases that have perpetuated genetic stop and frisk, essentially, and eroded sacred privacy rights. The bill will state that no person other than a designated offender shall be required to provide a DNA sample or inclusion in the statewide DNA identification index. And the bill would require that any DNA record currently stored in the DNA identification index by any municipality to be expunged within 90 days by the effective date of the bill. Because currently, if you are a non-convicted person and you have a profile in that database, there is no limit to how long your profile can be in that database. And there's also no limit to what the city can do with your DNA sample. They can match it, they can run it against other DNA samples at any crime scene that they want or in any investigation. And that's something that we believe is just not fair. And that, I can talk all day about it. I'll stop right there. That in substance is the DNA bill that, I want to talk to everyone about and shout it from the rooftops.
No, that's critical. And so when you say, when we're thinking about DNA, how and where is this DNA collected and who's negatively impacted by it?
So the DNA is collected by and large in precincts. Mm-hmm. So let me just sort of give you an example. If a young person that we represent, say a young person who's 14 years old, right, is suspected of carrying a gun. Like, say he got caught with his friends, and his friends, there was a gun involved, and they're trying to figure out who the gun belongs to. They bring the 14-year-old in for questioning at a precinct. The 14-year-old is being questioned by the cops, and the cops say, hey, if you give us a DNA sample, we can, clear your name, and we know the gun doesn't belong to you. We just need you to give us a DNA sample to prove it. Why don't you do that? And the 14-year-old is like, no, I don't want to do that. Or their parent says, no, I don't want to do that. What the NYPD does in that instance is they orchestrate a scene, right? Orchestrate a sort of this sort of collection ring, right? Where they would give that young person, say, a can of soda. The young person drinks from the can of soda, puts it down, walks out of the room. They can't take the can of soda with them because they can't have anything, any foreign objects on them while they're in the precinct or while they're being interrogated. That can of soda is then put in an evidence bag, and then a DNA sample of that young person is extracted from the can of soda. And that DNA profile is created and put in that database that I'm talking about. So to answer your second question, who are the people that are affected by this? It is mostly young people, young Black males and young Latino males specifically, who are constantly surveilled by police around the city, from Queens to Staten Island.
Who don't have a lawyer on retainer.
Who don't have a lawyer on retainer. I don't even have a lawyer. And, these are the folks, these are the kids that are these are young people that are getting arrested all the time. And those are just the young people. And I'm only talking about the young people because that's my specific client base. Mm-hmm. This happens to adults more than it does young people. So anybody who's arrested, anybody who's targeted or harassed constantly by the police, anyone who's brought into a precinct, anyone who, whether or not they're arrested or charged or convicted, anyone who from whom the cops are able to extract a DNA sample, are the people who are affected.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting that into perspective and making it so that folks understand, right, like how this impacts not just our young people, but middle-aged folks and old folks across our community that have their data essentially compromised in this respect and used in other instances. So I thank you for your work on this legislation. And I want to also, I have one more question before we move on to the next segment, which is where we'll talk about probation and parole justice. But one more question on the DNA piece. Where can we find or look at this legislation? I see a lot of my constituents who I recognize are commenting, on a lot of this stuff. So we want to figure out, like, where can people be active and support this legislation to ensure that DNA is not used in this matter?
Right. So the bill number is A06124 for your constituents. That bill number again is A06124. And for all the constituents of Assemblymember Anderson, you can look that bill up. You can contact Assemblymember Anderson. Sorry that your phone is going to ring off the hook now.
Okay.
And get your friends to contact their elected representatives and get this bill passed.
And just for the record, I am a co-sponsor of the bill. The bill is carried by Assemblywoman Zitterman out of Central Brooklyn, and the bill is critical. We want to make sure that these things can't continue to happen. So we talked about, and thank you so much, Brother Ward, for sharing this information. So we talked about clean slate, making sure that we give people second chance. We talked about making that happen through my legislation, or supporting that work through my legislation, Office of Expungement. We talked about the DNA database. Now I want to talk about probation and parole justice, right? We're talking about looking at the prison industrial complex in a way of making sure that community supervision is the tools and means for allowing folks to return home, but I have the resources that they need to return home. And for folks who live in the 31st Assembly District, I want to take a quick victory lap. And when I was a candidate for the Assembly, we pushed vigorously for the federal government via a public pressure campaign for the federal government to close New York City's lone privately owned and privately operated prison by the GEO Group, right in Springfield Gardens, right in our backyards. And I'm so thankful that the GEO Group is no longer operating at that facility in Springfield Gardens. So we have ended the practice of private prisons here in the city of New York by closing that facility. And I'm proud to have been a part of that advocacy. When we talk about probation and parole, when we talk about making sure that people who are coming back home and reintegrating into our communities have helpful ways of completing community supervision and parole, as it's called now. And I'm a proud co-sponsor, and I believe you are too, Assemblywoman Cruz, of the Less is More bill. This is a piece of legislation that would limit the amount of the first limit folks returning to Rikers Island or returning to jail or prison in that respect, for technical parole violations. I didn't show up to my AA meeting, or I missed curfew, or I didn't make it to XYZ meeting. At this moment and in this time, those folks can be sent back, and remanded for missing those critically important appointments. However, we don't think that that is the best means of making sure that we're moving people forward. And that's why Less is More is a piece of legislation that's being carried by a colleague from Brooklyn, another colleague from Brooklyn. We gotta start running up the scoreboard up here, Catalina, because these colleagues from Brooklyn getting all these bills. But Less is More. One allows people who are subject to community supervision, which is parole, to receive earned time credits, which encourages positive behavior and also accelerates discharge. So if we have folks who are showing up to all their meetings and they're doing their community service and they're following the processes in which their parole states, we want to encourage that and we want to reward it. Secondly, what the bill does is it raises the standards for parole officers that issue a notice of violation or arrest warrant for someone who's accused of a parole violation. You can't just give out parole violations like water. And so we're raising that standard with this bill to ensure, right? To ensure that there is a higher standard for violating someone for their parole. So critically important, so important in the way of making sure we keep people out of returning to being caged, honestly. And thirdly, what the bill does is it ensures that people who are alleged to have violated the terms of their community supervision or parole get a hearing, get due process before they're possibly returned, to incarceration, which we hope they wouldn't. But this adds that level of democracy in this space, which is so important. Fourthly, what the bill does is it limits the circumstances under which people who are under community supervision may be reincarcerated for violations under the terms of their supervision, and capping the length of such reincarceration. So in other words, what that means, I'm reading the language verbatim so people can understand it, and we can begin to understand how to read legislation. But in this context, what that means is that if in fact the hearing says that you are to return, you have violated, and you are to return, that there's a cap on what that return to reincarceration looks like, and shortening that time frame for those hearings. So making sure that those hearings aren't 3 months out or 4 months out or 3 years out in the case of the late Kalief Browder, who was waiting waiting a long time. And so what this bill does, less is more, and it really right sizes the ship as it relates to making sure that community supervision is used for just that, making sure that we keep people here at home. So if there aren't any questions from the audience regarding the three topics that we discussed so far, I want to jump into hearing from our Assemblywoman again about the recent bill that she announced with the Attorney General regarding police accountability, which we're so proud of, seeing you there on the big stage talking about police accountability with the top law enforcement officer of the state of New York, first Black woman to do it. And it's an honor to see that you were there representing. So can we talk a little bit about that bill and what it's going to do to help advance criminal justice reform?
We love ourselves some Tish James.
Yes, we do.
Saint Tish. She's come to the rescue of our community every single time we've needed it. Some folks may not remember this, but when we thought that we were going to lose driver's licenses for all because the governor tried to say that it was unconstitutional, literally in the middle of the debate, while the Senate was arguing it, here comes in Tish, whoosh, swoops in, makes her statement, and all is well with the world. And so when Tish says, can you come and support this? You don't ask questions, you just ask.
That's right.
I'm going to be there and tell me where it is.
Really quickly, Catalina, driver's licenses for all, for people who don't know. What's that?
Driver's licenses for all was a bill that we passed about 2 years ago that ensures anyone can have an access to a driver's license regardless of immigration status. And that is key because it ensures that people who are in our streets actually can drive. Like, it's as simple as that. And people are already doing it without a license because they're undocumented so that they can get to work. And it's more of an issue in the upstate and rural areas because people got to get to the farm, people got to get to work, to childcare. And so we just wanted to make sure that we were doing right by our immigrant community. And Tish came in and basically stood with our immigrant community like she always does. And this time around, what she was looking to do was make sure that we were creating real standards over what constitutes use of force. And we often talk about that concept, and you'll hear advocates for criminal justice reform and advocates for people staying alive when they encounter the police saying that whatever the incident is, that looks like particular excessive use of force. But there isn't a definition in the law. There actually is a definition in the patrol guide, and there's guidance in the patrol guide for police officers in New York City. But if you go look at the law, there isn't one. And so when you have an officer that during the whatever encounter was with a regular non-officer person, where a regular person either beats them or murders them, and we want to make a statement, an accusation, or get a conviction that it was excessive use of force, there isn't a basis for us to do it. And what this bill does is create that baseline that says this is what it's going to be, and this is what a reasonable person would do under the same circumstances. And it's going to allow both the DAs, when it's DA's job to step in, as well as when it's Tish's job to step in, because she does have the power to step into some of these investigations, to have a real delineated baseline for which to tell a jury, here's what you can convict someone on. And our hope is that this will create clarity, and this will allow us to get the convictions we're looking to get. It's hard to get a conviction when you don't know what the conduct that constitutes a crime is. Like, morally, we know what's wrong, but legally, it's a whole other thing. And our folks from the Legal Aid Society can attest to that. Sometimes we can see that something is morally wrong, but when we step into a courtroom and we can't prove it because there's no law that allows us to actually say that is wrong, then it becomes an issue. And what we're hoping to do here is actually change that. And the two sponsors, the main sponsors, are Assemblymember Perry and Senator Parker, and we are. I'm playing the supportive role, and I'm making sure that I can bring some of that Latino community love into this, because one of the things that often happens is every time we see, because it's more often than not, some of our Latino members of the community have died at the hands of police, but it's generally our Black friends and our Black family. And I think it's the kind of thing that we need to stand with each other and say, whoever it is that dies didn't deserve to die at the hands of the police, and we're going to hold them accountable.
Absolutely. And just to give some context, and you can correct me, Assemblywoman Cruz, there was, by executive order, the allowance of the Attorney General to jump into some of these police brutality cases. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Yes, and not just that, but last year there was the creation of the specific name is escaping me, but it's basically an arm of Tish's office, and I call her Tish Attorney General James. I give her the title she earned, Attorney General James. Within her office, there's the ability. We created it by law to have an independent investigation. As independent as independent can get right now, investigation when there is an instance of police or an allegation of police misconduct, or generally it's a murder when she can step in.
Mm-hmm. Now, Brother Ward, before I invite, thank you for that, Assemblywoman Cruz. Before I invite your colleague Emma to jump on, I want to ask, and I think also, Catalina, you could jump in here too. As it relates to our brothers and sisters who are in the immigrant community and are impacted by the criminal injustice system, if you will, what does some of this legislation, particularly the Police Accountability Bill, do to help protect our friends and family in those spaces?
So that's a really good question, and I don't know the specific answer to that, but I imagine that the Police Accountability Bill would, help protect all citizens across the city that are, negatively affected by over policing. And some of the communities that, I feel like one of the most prevalent communities that are affected by over policing, particularly under the last presidential administration, is the immigrant community. So if we can sort of put the brakes on the way these communities, particularly the immigrant community and Black and brown communities, are over policed, over surveilled, and over harassed by the NYPD, then I think it'll positively affect all those folks.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Cruz, did you want to take a stab at that?
I think Mr. Ward did a pretty good. I'm just trying to think of if there was anything else that I could add to that. Something which is politicians knowing when everything's been said.
There we go. There we go. And the reason why I asked that question, being selfish here in the context of my district, we are a predominantly foreign-born district where 42% of folks who live in Assembly District 31 were born elsewhere before they moved here. And so that's critically important because we want to make sure that those folks who are living here now and are in this space are protected and know their rights. And most of the folks who are foreign-born who live in the 31st Assembly District are of Latinx descent and of the South Asian American descent, as well as Afro-Caribbean descent, so from the islands. And so we have a lot of folks, again, who are foreign-born and may be coming over and living here in the district and across New York City that just don't know their rights and don't know the work that we're doing in the criminal justice space to ensure that they're safe and to ensure that we're making laws that are fair and equitable in this respect in this space. So that's why I also asked Assemblyman Cruz to just, again, reiterate why driver's license for all is important and why these bills and critical pieces of legislation, Jose Peralta Act, all these bills and things that you worked so heavily on impacts all of our communities across this borough of Queens.
Cleo, I'm so glad that you mentioned the high percentage of foreign-born folks in your district, because a lot of them are Caribbean, like Black Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And generally, there's been this conversation that has centered around Latino immigrants, and often, unfortunately, kind of puts to the side Black immigrants, and it shouldn't be like that. You know, even when you're talking about dreamers or undocumented folks, there's a lot of folks in the Caribbean community, in the African community, who are living just as painfully as many of the Latinos in my district, but we're not having those conversations. But that feels like it's a whole topic for another day. But we should do that. We should. See, we just found ourselves a topic for another one of these chats.
There we go. There we go. Thank you so much, Assemblywoman Cruz. And let's bring on Emma and talk. Let's hear from you, Emma. And I wanted to bring you on today from the Legal Aid Society to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do and what you're working on.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Sorry for joining late. Was putting my baby to sleep. My name's Emma Goodman. I'm an attorney in the Special Litigation Unit at the Legal Aid Society in our criminal practice, so do very similar work to what Shamari does, but in the criminal practice. I've worked at Legal Aid for 11 years now, and 3.5 years ago in 2017, I moved to our Special Litigation Unit after doing criminal defense work in Manhattan to create our record sealing and expungement project, which is called the Case Closed Project. That project was started when the sealing law Assemblymember Cruz referenced went into effect. So we thought when that law went into effect that there were about 600,000 people that were eligible for sealing. We thought we needed dedicated attorneys to spend all of their time filing sealing applications. And what turned out happening is that the law just isn't working. People don't know about it. The people that do know about it don't know how to access resources. My project has filed more sealing applications than anyone else in the state of New York, but we've only filed about 200. And out of all of that 600,000 people, 2,498 people have had their records sealed statewide in 3.5 years. That's less than 1/2 of 1%. It's ridiculous. So it's not working. And me and a bunch of other advocates went to Assemblymember Cruz and Senator Myrie and said, this isn't working, we need to do something. And that's what led to Clean Slate. So that is my broken record topic of conversation these days. Clean Slate is something that really comes out of direct experiences of people that have records and have experienced the perpetual punishment of having a criminal record, and people like me who represent people that have records and see what it's like and see how hard it is. I've been representing people, like I said, for more than 10 years in the world of, the criminal world, but for 3.5 years, I've been representing people that are eligible for sealing. And it's awful. It's just awful to sit down and talk with people, even people that are eligible for this very limited sealing law. They've been suffering for decades, literally decades. to get jobs that they're capable of doing. I had a client a couple of years ago who had 3 graduate degrees and was a volunteer first responder on 9/11. She had cancer from being a volunteer first responder on 9/11 and still made it through graduate school while doing chemo. She was amazing, one of the most amazing people I ever met. She couldn't get a job. And we had to go through an application process. It took us almost a year to get her record sealed because she had a 25-year-old nonviolent felony conviction. She got her record sealed. A month later, she had the job that she deserved. A month after that, she got a promotion. And she's doing great, and it's amazing. But she should, and it feels really good to say that and to do that, but that was 25 years that she was suffering before we got to that point. And she wouldn't have gotten to that point without the help of a lawyer. And she was someone that lived in New York City and was able to find me and access me. But there are literally millions of people that are suffering like that deserve to move forward with their lives. And Clean Slate would allow them to do that. So I'm very hopeful it will pass. I think it would make a big difference in people's lives. I'm also a big fan of all the other bills everyone's talking about tonight. Less is More is a really incredible bill. It would significantly reduce the population of people on Rikers Island because a huge number of the people being held on Rikers Island are being held waiting to have a parole hearing, often for technical violations. And when we say technical violations, what we mean is like not checking it, like staying out past curfew, not showing up for a meeting. Technical violation means a non-criminal, non-serious violation. And under the current system, people are held in custody, sometimes for months at a time, waiting to have a hearing to see if their parole will be extended for doing something like not checking in with their parole officer on the right day and showing up a day later. It's not new arrests, it's not new criminal behavior. It's just not following their very specific rules. And it's a ridiculous system that we have that holds people in jail and perpetually punishes them. And Less is More would put a lot of systems in place that would stop that from happening. So I think that bill is pretty amazing. And I'm very hopeful they both pass.
Absolutely, and they're critically important to the discussion that we're having. I wanna transition a little bit, Emma, for you to talk about resources that are available to New Yorkers, to people who live in my district, people who live in Assemblywoman Cruz's district, from the Legal Aid Society. Before we get into that, let me do a quick plug. I want to just thank everybody who's been watching. So far, we've hit over 50 participants and viewers just on the Facebook side. I haven't checked all the other pages, but it's important that you guys tune in as we're sharing this critical, important information, but also that you guys understand what we're doing as legislators, as attorneys, two folks who are here, but as in the activist scene, to ensure that, one, how do you plug in? Two, how do you support your legislators who are doing that work? And three, how do you share these anecdotal stories that help us write this legislation? There are stories behind every bill that we write in many aspects, whether it was a constituent that was impacted, whether it was a group or organization that knew somebody that was impacted. Your stories matter, your stories are important, and your stories help inform and enhance legislation. So I think it's so critically important. So Emma, talk about some of the resources that are available from the Legal Aid Society to New Yorkers.
Sure. So Legal Aid is the biggest public defender organization in the country. And we have, I think we kind of have our hands in everything. So you heard that Shamari does works in our juvenile practice doing law reform work there. I work in our criminal practice. We have an immigrant, a group of people that represent immigrants. We have a very large civil practice that represents people in housing court, in various other civil proceedings. So we have just an incredibly broad array of services that we offer. Generally speaking, if you contact the Legal Aid Society, we have, I think, 16 or 17 offices around New York City. So we have criminal practice in every borough, a juvenile practice in every borough, and then several community offices where we have other types of civil community support, including a few offices in Queens, where I live too, so go Queens. And generally speaking, if we don't do it, then we know who does. So we're a good place to reach out to, I think, for any type of legal support that you might need. We really try to cover all of everyone's bases as much as we can.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And this question is open to all of our panelists. We have folks who fearmonger. If you change anything with the criminal justice system, you're going to let all the criminals out. If you reduce the size of police budgets, our community is going to automatically become less safe. For anybody who wants to comment on some of these notions and conspiracy theories, in my opinion, what do we say to folks who are fearful of criminal justice reform as it relates to threatening community safety?
Look, I think one of the things that I've learned the best in working in these circles is sometimes you just got to shut up and listen. Sometimes it's not about you, and it's about the bigger picture and the good for humanity. And when people come and use that whole "what about survivors" and "what about victims," I'm like, you're talking to one, and you can't use that excuse. And so I think sometimes for my colleagues, the elected, sometimes we just have to shut up and listen. And for the everyday person, sometimes I as well, I think you sometimes have to just be quiet, listen, understand the stories, and just have some empathy, for Christ's sakes. Just have some empathy, because you might have had a good life, but not everybody did. Not everybody had the opportunity to have a 2-parent home, grow up in a house where you didn't have to struggle to pay rent, figure out where you get food. And if sometimes that means some of these teen folks ended up in gangs, ended up stealing, and that's just the way it is sometimes. And that doesn't mean that that's the way it always has to be. So if that's the life that they've led because they've had it that rough, why can't we open up the doors to give them a real chance at a real life?
Absolutely. Brother Ward, do you want to share a little bit? Thank you for that really, really impassioned and straightforward answer.
Yeah, and so the question is, what do you say to fearmongers who say, if with all this police reform, we're just going to turn into like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome?
I will say that was a fun movie, so if turning to that, I would have been mad.
It's the first movie that came to mind. It is a good movie. I think Assemblymember Cruz is absolutely right. I think you start with listening, right? And to be clear, like, Assemblymember Cruz, Assemblymember Anderson, you all have constituents. You have to listen to them. You have to, you all are public servants, and you have to work for these folks. And I admire that, because you all have, an amount of patience that I just don't. And when people fearmonger, I've picked a side. Like, I work for a public defender organization. I believe in rights for folks, no matter what's happening in their lives. I believe that families should stay together. I believe that people, even if they commit a crime, should be treated with some humanity. And to the extent that we do not treat people with humanity, even people who, have ended up on the wrong side of the law, like, we've become a society that, is worse than the people that we admonish, right? So I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be a part of a society that, treats people poorly or like, treats people like they're irredeemable. Incorrigible is the word that they used to use to describe young folks, which means like,
beyond actually incorrigible.
Right, and it just got removed. That language just got removed, and that word is like hundreds of years old and was used in like a very archaic way. And I guess what I say to them is, right, I just listen, like Assemblymember Cruz said, I listen. And if there's anything that I can extrapolate from what they say, I try to have a conversation with them about that. But if the person I'm talking to is someone who is just beyond reason, then there's really no reason for me to, for me to engage. I have a limited amount of energy. Like Emma, I have a toddler who, has allowed me to have this, come to this conference and speak without sitting on my lap. And I just don't have the energy to entertain all those conversations. I'm also not an elected official, and you all have the kind of energy that is just like admirable. So yeah, I listen when I can, I engage when I can, and when I don't feel like it, I just don't, because I work really hard every day and I come home and I'm tired and I know I'm doing the right thing, and I don't think, I need anyone to question that.
I like it. I like it. Thank you, Assemblywoman Cruz and Mr. Ward, for sharing your responses. We're getting ready to close out with some questions and answers from the audience. Emma, did you want to jump in? I'm sorry, Emma, I didn't even give you. Did you want to jump in on that?
No, it's fine. I just have a very helpful statistic that I actually think is really incredible when people say that stuff. So in the context of clean slate, they actually did a study in Michigan where they have a sealing law, and they found that people that have their records sealed, after their records are sealed, the recidivism rate, the likelihood that they will re-offend and commit a new crime, is lower than that of the general population that never committed a crime in the first place. So people that get their records sealed, people that get their records expunged, are better citizens, better community members than people that have never been part of the criminal system, because they know what the criminal system does. They've experienced it. If they're given those opportunities, if they're given a chance to get a job, get housing, get an education, they will take advantage of that in a way that somebody that hasn't seen what the other side is like wouldn't. So they are better people, and they make our communities safer if we give people those opportunities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Ms. Goodman. And sharing that piece is critically important. We want people to understand that this is why we do the work that we do. And I guess before I go into questions and answers on that very point, what gives each of you guys hope in continuing this work? It's very draining. Dealing with constituents, me and you both know, Catalina, dealing with constituents, you both know, being in a legal space, cases that you may win or lose, or issues that really need legislation to make sure that folks are heard properly. What gives you hope in this space and in this work? I see Assemblywoman Cruz got her hope right there in the glass.
I mean, it's a Thursday night. I start vacation tomorrow, so it's technically Friday for me. So
I hear that.
I think one of the things that gives me hope is that if kids that grew up like you and I did, Khalil, in the hood, are given the right chances, are given the opportunities to shine, you end up in places of power, in places where you can change the lives of others. And I understand that's privilege. I easily could have been a statistic. You easily could have been a statistic, but we got lucky. Why should it be about luck? Why isn't every child and every young person in our community given the same opportunity? And when they've encountered a roadblock, why aren't we helping remove that roadblock? To me, the hope isn't so much because it's some ideal and there's rainbows and puppies and sunshine. To me, it's because if we don't do it, we that got to see how hard it is on the ground, who's going to? I've had friends say those closest to the pain. I know the Congresswoman Ayana has said closest to the pain are closest to the answer. A friend of mine says those closest to the pain will fight for the hardest, because we understand it's the same concept that our colleague from Emma just said. When you've been involved in the criminal justice system and you're able to get that second chance, you don't want to go back. You're doing everything you can to get out of it. And so it's the same thing. When you've experienced hunger, possibility of homelessness, you've been in the kinds of neighborhoods that are affected by these issues, you know what it's like. You're going to fight for it the hardest to make sure that the members of your community don't have to face it. And so what gives me hope, it isn't so much hope as it is drive. What keeps me driven is that there's still so much work to do. And if you and I, Khalil, and Mr. Warden, Ms. Goodman, and all of the folks who are supporting us, if we don't do it, then who's going to fight for these folks?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Catalina. That's deep and that's real. And I want to say that, again, someone who has grown up in Far Rockaway, lived here, experienced our highs and our lows. I want to drive our community to more highs, to where our communities have everything that it needs to be the best possible successful, addressing transportation, addressing the criminal injustice system, making sure that we have access to safe and affordable housing. These are the things that drive me, because these are the things that I've suffered through and lived with, and my experiences inform the experiences of our district, and informs my policy, my way of thinking, and how we can work to improve the lives of others. If the panelists want to jump on this one, or want to get one more in, and then we got to wrap up with Q&A from the audience. Yeah, want to jump in?
The question was, what gives us hope, right?
Yeah.
So, the short answer for me is just the numbers, like support, like people, supporters. We have, we have people in our little legal community in New York City, little, public defense or even like public interest legal community in New York that like have been doing this work for a really long time. Emma just sat there and told you she's been doing this work for a really long time too. Like Emma's a bit of an OG. Like I look up to people like Emma, and the fact that people like this exist just sort of gives me hope, because I know I have a community. I know I have people behind me. I know I have people, that are colleagues and they're professionals and they're good at what they do. And they also see what I see about injustices that need to be corrected, and they have taken on the mantle to sort of like make change happen because they have a crowd behind them. And we saw what happened, with the Knicks last night. If you have a crowd behind you, if you have support and you have people cheering you on, almost anything's possible, even an Obi Toppin dunk.
I like that.
Now, if we can only do that for the Mets.
There we go. There we go. Emma, you want to take a crack at it? Thank you so much, Brother Ward.
What gives me hope this year is that this last year has been one of the hardest years that I think any of us have ever experienced. But people are fighting harder and are putting more into changing things than I've ever seen happen in New York. I really feel like people are committed to positive change in a way that they weren't before. And coming out of such an incredibly difficult year, an incredibly emotional year, it feels like maybe some of that fighting last year was worth it. Some of that protesting has actually done something. And if that worked, then we should keep doing it.
Absolutely. And thank you both, all three of you, for sharing, that critical piece on what keeps you motivated and why you do this work. We noticed that tonight when we discussed the DNA legislation, that our viewers just jumped up. People definitely were tuned in and had questions. And we're concerned about the DNA piece. So obviously that means team in the backstage that we gotta make sure that we get that information out, so that people understand that DNA is a critical part of criminal justice reform, and making sure it's used. It's not used without folks knowing, and among the other many things that's wrong with how DNA is used in this space. But Mr. Ward, can you talk a little bit about how the Chanel Lewis case over in Howard Beach impacted DNA, the space of DNA and DNA social justice work?
Is this the Howard Beach jogger case?
Yes.
So that case was, I know that hits home for you all, being a Queens person. That was an awful thing that happened to that woman. It really was. And, it was sad to see. It was also sad to see what happened in the aftermath of a very heinous crime, just an awful situation. And what we saw was a witch hunt. So I don't know if this is something that folks know, or I know this was news for a while, but following that crime, right, following that murder, the NYPD essentially did a dragnet, and they knocked on the doors of like hundreds of Queens folks, of Eastern Brooklyn folks from East New York and that area, Brownsville, knocked out hundreds of and took DNA swabs from them so they can conduct the investigation. Now, I understand that some might see that as just police work, but that is an incredible violation of people's rights. Like there are instances in the court of law. If you want someone's DNA, if the government wants someone's DNA, they have to get a warrant for that. To knock on someone's door and conduct a search, a genetic search, essentially, you need a warrant for that. And if that's something that we're going to allow to happen, the bounds of that are scary, and we have to put the brakes on that. And yes, that was an awful thing that happened, but
when you say dragnet, what do you mean by dragnet?
So what I mean by dragnet is literally that, right? Just imagine a gigantic net cast over Far Rockaway, Howard Beach, Broad Channel, East New York, even parts of like Ridgewood, Jamaica, Brownsville, and Seaview. Like there was a mass sprawling investigation into any person who fit the description which was admittedly pretty faulty, and the description was of a black male. So they just randomly took DNA samples from black males in any of those communities, any and every of those communities.
Nearly 400 DNA samples were drawn from folks in those neighborhoods.
Hundreds, and in some instances, there was a New York Times article about this. There were many instances where the cops knocked on doors of people who they knew were undocumented people from other countries that were not undocumented, and threatened them with deportation if they didn't give a sample, if they didn't give a DNA sample. And that's atrocious. Like I said earlier, we can't treat people like that. That is not the way you treat people who are presumably innocent. And that,
I have to say, in that particular case, as I remember it, the news cycle was so obsessed with everything that was happening and with finding someone that was guilty that they weren't really paying attention to all the other issues that were happening around it, how we were treating members of the community. And I agree with you, it was a horrible case, but this obsession with finding the guilty party created the kind of situation that really that actually created even more victims, and didn't really improve the way in which we investigate heinous crimes like this.
Right, and the way that relates to the DNA bill is that a lot of those folks who had DNA taken, who the NYPD, from whom the NYPD took DNA, they had DNA profiles created for them and put in that rogue database that we're trying to regulate. So there's a direct correlation between what happened following the Howard Beach jogger investigation and the DNA bill that we're proposing here.
And Shamar, let's be real, the NYPD is notorious for keeping lists of things that they say they don't keep lists of. The whole gang database was a whole mess, and the commissioner now seems pretty proud of it, and what it's done and how he himself has used it. But routinely, it's not people that look like him that get put into those lists. It's people that look like us.
Absolutely. And here's a really fun fact. There is one population of folks that are not required and are often instructed against having their own DNA sample put into that database, even just for control purposes. And that population is NYPD police officers.
Oh, why am I not surprised?
And I'm not, you can't make this stuff up. Like, I wish I was good enough to write stuff like this, but I'm not. You cannot make this stuff up.
You can't make this. This sounds like a perfect episode of Law & Order Special Victims Unit.
Absolutely. All right, so we're getting ready to close out. I wanted to see if anyone from the audience, just 2 minutes really quickly, anyone from the audience had any questions, comments, concerns. Obviously, the DNA piece was a hot topic. Sure, we definitely want to come back to it and talk more on it. And a lot of people jumped on, and we saw our viewers spike when we talked about it because people really want to know this information, and it's so critically important. So if there are any questions or concerns from the audience, people want to drop anything on our social media chats, now's the opportunity to do so. so that you can have your questions answered by these experts on the issue and subject matter. I just run the show. These are the experts, and I wanna allow time for that to happen. If there aren't any questions, gonna give it a minute or so.
Well, I just want to thank you, Khalil, for hosting this important conversation. I think it's no mistake that I, as a Latina legislator and you as a Black legislator, are having this conversation about criminal justice reform and the need for our community. I think it's an opportunity for our communities to come together to support each other, because this is the kind of thing that is going to save lives, change lives, and really create the kind of community we deserve to live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And it's an honor to work with you. And let's continue to do this work. Absolutely. Emma, I saw you try to get in there.
Oh, not about that. That was I was interrupting something much more important. I just, one thing that I didn't talk about that I want to make sure people know about, and I've asked to be shared in the chat, is marijuana legalization and marijuana expungement. That was something that I worked on and has already passed, so we weren't talking about it tonight. But when we're talking about the police rounding up young Black and brown men to take their DNA, one of the ways that they do that is by pretending that they smell marijuana on the streets. That is no longer a reason why the police can stop and detain somebody just by smelling the odor of marijuana. That's because of the MRTA that passed earlier this year. There's also automatic expungement for any possession offense of up to a pound and any sale offense of up to 25 grams. And there are a bunch of other options for people that have other types of convictions too. So it's a pretty incredible bill. I've started putting resources together that are available on our website about the expungement piece, but people should definitely be educating themselves about what legalized marijuana actually means. It's not 100% legal, and if you are an immigrant, you should definitely educate yourself and talk to people to make sure that you are enjoying it without getting yourself into any trouble. But it's a pretty incredible thing. It's complicated. So educate yourself, and there are going to be a lot of resources. There's going to be a lot of money coming into the communities that you both represent, and people need to take advantage of that. And we're talking about billions of dollars for people to be able to start businesses and get involved in the legalized marijuana business. And it's really going to change communities, I hope, for the better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ms. Goodman, Mr. Ward, Assemblywoman Cruz, for joining me tonight for our monthly community conference series where we bring the issues to the community, bring the issues to our constituencies. We talked about criminal justice tonight in many different forms and facets, how it impacts the immigrant community, how it impacts Black and brown communities, how it impacts people who are justice involved. And it's so important that we have a well-rounded discussion about the things that we're doing in Albany, but also the things that folks are doing on the ground, people, advocates and activists are doing, and let you all know how you can plug into that critically important work. Look, the truth is that the disenfranchisement of justice involves community members. Barriers to employment, housing, education, are giant doors of opportunities that are closed in the faces of people attempting to turn their lives around. And when combined with lack of services, right? When we're combining that with excessively being overly punitive, probation and parole regulations, disenfranchisement further restricts people who are justice involved and locking them out from opportunities that can help them rehabilitate, help them be successful, help them reintegrate in this moment. But at the end of the day, we've got to answer this critical question, and this is a question we're answering in our generation, and hopefully we answer it in our generation, and so that generations ahead don't impact it. And the question is, if a person has paid their dues to society, why do we continue to punish? Are we in the space of overly punishing, or are we in the space of rehabilitation and correction, true corrections? We got to lift these barriers. We got to make sure that people have opportunities. We have to make sure we reform this criminal and justice system so that people who've made mistakes have the supports they need. And for people who might fall into these traps, know their rights, and know that we're here to fight and protect them. So I want to thank my amazing panelists, some which I pulled out of vacation, others of which I pulled away from sleeping babies, and Brother Ward, who I'm sure wants to ride that bike behind him. I pulled him away from that because this conversation is so, so critically important. And we want to continue to fight the good fight. And do this work. Please follow me on social media platforms. Please follow Legal Aid Society. And of course, please stay up in touch with your legislators. Assemblywoman Cruz also is on social media as well. Follow us, because we are doing the work and we're working to resolve these issues and address the concerns that our community has around criminal justice reform. Let's continue to do the work. I'm so thankful for our amazing panel and to my staff who's backstage working the magic to get us on Facebook Live, on Twitter, and on Instagram. Thank you so much for your work. Much appreciated to you all. We want to make sure that we move towards restoration, and this is the start of that in these discussions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks.
Be well, everybody. See you next month, everyone.